Hey guys, what's going on? Laying back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Mr. Harrigan's Phone. Mr. Harrigan's Phone is an American horror thriller based on the Stephen King novella of the same name, and tells the story of Craig, a high school student in Harlow, Maine, who befriends John Harrigan, a reclusive billionaire with failing eyesight. He employs Craig as a reader for several years, which Craig eventually thanks him for by giving him a cell phone. Shortly after Mr. Harrigan receives the phone, he unexpectedly passes away, which devastates Craig and motivates him to leave his phone inside his casket. Strange events begin to occur soon after, as Craig starts to receive communication from Mr. Harrigan's phone beyond the grave. With Halloween fast approaching, I was excited to watch a Stephen King adaptation to kick off the horror season, but this proved to be an underwhelming experience. It's not terrible by any means, as there is some level of intrigue behind it, but it doesn't have the same degree of suspense or scares one would expect from King's work. The main character, Craig, is kinda bland, but he does a decent enough job at carrying the story. He frequently struggles with loneliness on account of his mother's death, and his actor Jaden Martell is great at conveying the inner turmoil he goes through because of this. The movie balances between his past when he first meets Mr. Harrigan and his present where the rest of the movie takes place. I did like to an extent that the movie takes time to establish Craig's background in this regard instead of rushing into the more intense stuff, and his narrations add some additional context where it wouldn't be appropriate through spoken dialogue. At the same time, though, I felt like there was too much context. A lot of what Craig says in his head isn't really important for what happens in the story, and because there's a lot of narration, it tends to make the story's pacing slower than necessary, not to mention that the transition between past and present is kind of jarring. Mr. Harrigan, who's played by Donald Sutherland, was definitely the most interesting part about the movie. He's an understated man who knows he has some influence over Craig and fills a gap left by his mother, but doesn't go out of his way to be another parental figure in his life. He has a lot of great quotes that fit well with his character. There's just a certain degree of ruthlessness behind his mannerisms and actions as this enigmatic billionaire in the middle of rural America that feels sinister, and it's great as far as setting up this air of mystery around him, but the movie never takes full advantage of his potential. Part of the problem in this regard revolves around the phone gimmick that the movie relies on. Now, I think the idea of Craig being spoken to by a deceased character and having his actions being influenced by said character is a good concept, but it takes way too long to get going, and it's not just because of the narrations. Craig rarely does anything significant outside of being an ordinary high school student. He goes to class, hangs out with friends, and deals with a bully. It's pretty typical slice of life stuff, and throughout all of this, the phone doesn't even make an appearance until the movie is well into the second act. At that point, it seemed like the movie suddenly rushed into things and didn't give much explanation into how Harrigan is supposedly communicating to Craig even though he's supposed to be dead. I don't mind not having things fully explained, but the way the movie just abruptly shifts gears without warning was pretty weird to put it mildly. The way the whole culture is depicted around cell phones was probably the strangest thing about the movie. It takes place in the late 2000s when smartphones were starting to become popular, so it makes sense that people would be fascinated by them, but the movie goes way overboard with how obsessed people were with them. As someone who was a teenager in a rural high school when iPhones were starting to pop up, it was hilarious to see things like entire cliques of people being segregated by models of phones they were using. It's easy to tell that this movie was written by an older man who clearly did not understand how kids at the time reacted to this technology. It also felt like the movie was trying way too hard to demonize cell phones as things that were going to ruin future generations. There's an entire scene dedicated to Mr. Harrigan ranting about all the ways cell phones will affect people, almost like he's going down a checklist. I'm all for having social messages in movies, but this one felt incredibly forced and out of touch. This may sound hypocritical considering how this tended to slow the movie down, but my favorite part about it was seeing the relationship between Craig and Harrigan build over time. The scenes where they're together and exchange debates over literary themes and their personalities clashing are intriguing, and they're some of the only times where there's any sort of uncomfortable tension. Some of it can be felt through the movie's rural Maine setting too. I like the contrast between Craig's lower middle class and Harrigan's elite class worlds, and how they intertwine with American landmarks in the towns of Harlow and Gates Falls. The Maine setting is standard for a Stephen King story, but it still works. The movie has a great aesthetic presentation beyond the scenery as well, with the variety of camera angles it uses and the melancholic soundtrack. This combined with the stakes that rise once Harrigan starts tormenting people beyond the grave was exciting, and it felt like the movie was building towards something big, so it's a shame that it never hits any major payoff and sort of just fizzles out toward the end. The lack of other compelling characters doesn't help with things either. Most of them are little more than lame stereotypes that exist for the sake of the story, the worst one of which was the bully Kenny, who exists only to cause conflict when it's convenient for the sake of the story. I don't know why it's so hard for filmmakers to write a good bully character, but good, this one is not. Beyond all of this though, the movie simply isn't scary, and that's kind of important for a horror or thriller movie to achieve. There was some suspense here and there, but it never kept me on the edge of my seat. Anytime the movie started to get interesting, it tended to go in another direction and become monotonous all over again. And the way it tries to combine its horror elements with a sort of coming-of-age narrative doesn't always work. It's nice to see Crag bond with Mr. Harrigan, and one can definitely see where the movie was going with the relationship, but as enjoyable as it was, the slow pacing of the first act and rushed pacing of the other acts leave it feeling incomplete. The central themes behind the story, which I interpreted as injustice and revenge, were also hard to get behind considering how little Crag stands up for himself and fails pretty much any time he does so. They're executed at a basic enough level to be fine for the story, but it still proved disappointing with how mundane they were. Overall, Mr. Harrigan's Phone is yet another mediocre Stephen King adaptation that doesn't fall below the mark, but doesn't go above it either. If you're a hardcore fan of Stephen King's work, or don't mind thrillers that are a bit lopsided in pacing, you might enjoy checking this out. If the movie had been cut down and sped up a bit at the beginning, I think it would have fared better, but as of now, it's more or less just okay. All of the ingredients are there to make a solid horror thriller, but these same ingredients as they are in this movie are undercooked, and the movie is worse for it as a result. What did you think about this movie? Did you enjoy the way the main characters were portrayed, or did you also find it lacking in suspense? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Mr. Harrigan's Phone. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Italian drama, Jumping from High Places. Bye bye!